On June 1st, 1989, 3 women checked into a motel in Tampa, Florida. However, after a few days, the motel's housekeeping noticed the room wasn't being used. Although all their luggage was still inside, the 3 women didn't seem to be returning to the room. After informing the manager, the motel called the police and reported the mysterious disappearance of 3 guests. A few hours later, on June 4th, 3 bodies were recovered floating in Tampa Bay. It wasn't long before they put the 2 together and were able to identify the bodies. The victims were Joan Rogers and her 2 daughters, Michelle and Christe. And looking at the bodies, it was clear this was far from being an accident. The lifeless bodies of the 3 women were nude from the waist down. Their arms and legs had been bound, and their necks were tied with a rope attached to a cinder block in hopes that would weigh the bodies down enough to hide them, but it clearly hadn't. Medical examiners determined the 3 victims had died from asphyxiation and had been in the water for at least 2 days. Joan Rogers was 36 years old. She was married to Hal Rogers, and together they owned a dairy farm in Wilshire, Ohio, a small town dedicated mostly to farming. The couple met in high school, and after getting married in 1971, they had 2 daughters, Michelle, who was 17 in 1989, and Christe, who was 3 years younger. The girls were very different. Michelle was quiet and reserved, just like her dad, while Christe shared her mother's bubbly personality. The Rogers family worked long hours to keep their business up and running, waking up at the crack of dawn and not stopping for a minute until nighttime. Running a farm was a difficult task, but the family stuck together through it all. According to Hal, that summer in 1989, the family needed a vacation. 3 years earlier, it was discovered that his own brother John had allegedly sexually abused Michelle since she was a child, and police had managed to find indications of it while investigating him after an ex-girlfriend reported him for assaulting her. This had been happening for years, while Joan and Hal were on work trips or away for the day. Michelle didn't press charges since she was scared of her uncle, but the family was distraught. Although John Rogers was sent to prison for the charges in his ex-girlfriend's case, the weight of the events were taking a toll on the family. Finally, in 1989, after a few hard years, the family decided to leave for a short vacation in Florida. It was the first time the girls left Ohio, and they were very excited to take a road trip and see new places. Hal didn't join his wife and daughters since he needed to stay and work in the farm, but the 3 women packed the car and hit the road to wind down and recharge their batteries for a few days. The drive was long, and along the way they passed several states until they reached Florida, where they visited the Jacksonville Zoo, Kennedy Space Center, Walt Disney World. Finally, they reached one of their last stops, Tampa, where the girls were excited to go to the beach. On June 1st, 1989, the Rogers arrived in Tampa, but Joan was struggling to find her way to the motel they were supposed to stay at. Frustrated, she pulled over to have a closer look at the map printed on a Clearwater Beach brochure she'd picked up. While she tried to locate everything on the map, a white man in his mid-30s approached the car and offered directions. Joan was relieved to find the man knew exactly where they needed to go and gave him the brochure so he could write down the instructions on how to get to their motel. After chatting for a bit, he made the 3 women an offer. He had a boat and often took it out to watch the sunset, and he thought they might enjoy that. Since he'd been so friendly to them and seemed like a nice man, Joan accepted. He told them to meet him that evening at the boat ramp and look out for a blue and white boat. With that settled, Joan and the girls set off to their motel, where, thanks to the directions from the stranger, they checked in at 12:30 p.m. After spending the day out, Joan, Michelle, and Christe returned to the motel room for a bit before heading out to catch the sunset from the boat ride the man offered. During this time, these pictures were taken, one of Tampa Bay and another one of Michelle sitting on the floor of the room. These are the last pictures they would take on their trip. At around 7:30 p.m. on June 1st, 1989, witnesses saw them leave the motel and get into their car. The next time the women were seen, their bodies were being pulled out of the bay. Dental records confirmed that Joan, Michelle, and Christe were the victims found floating in the crystal waters of Tampa Bay by a tourist sailboat. The autopsy confirmed that 3 women were alive when they were tossed into the bay, since their lungs were filled with water. However, after at least 2, but possibly 3 days in the water, there was little to no more evidence that could be recovered from the bodies. No fingerprints, no fibers, and no confirmation of sexual abuse, although this last part was very likely, since all 3 of them were found nude from the waist down. Hal Rogers was cleared almost immediately, since many people in his hometown had seen him there all week, never leaving his farm for more than a few hours to have a meal at a local restaurant or get some groceries from the store. John, Hal's brother, was also investigated for his alleged abuse towards Michelle. It was thought that maybe he would have organized a hit from prison. However, there was no proof of his involvement either, and he was also cleared very early on in the investigation. On June 8th, 4 days after pulling out the bodies from the water, Joan's car was found in the parking lot near a public boat launch and very close to the motel. It seemed to have been there for days, as it was beginning to be covered in sand and dust. Inside, police found 2 notes written by 2 different people, one with directions to a motel written on a Clearwater Beach brochure, and the other with directions to the boat launch they were parked at, written on the motel's branded stationery. The note written on the motel's paper was determined to be Joan's handwriting. It contained information on how to get to the ramp, and the words blue with white. Investigators assumed this was a reference to a specific boat. The other note, however, the one on the brochure, was a mystery. After comparing the handwriting to all of the Rogers family, it didn't seem to belong to any of them. The note had directions to the motel the family was staying in, so it was very likely given to them by someone local. Since this seemed to be the only clue they were leaning on, investigators put together a theory that whoever gave them indications to the motel would know something about the boat as well. However, attempts at locating a blue and white boat proved to be unsuccessful. There was no boat in the area matching that vague description, so their only lead was going cold, until October of 1989, when investigators found something that could be related to the Rogers family murders. Back in the month of May, a 24-year-old Canadian tourist had reported that a man who offered her a free boat trip had sexually assaulted her. The report mentioned a boat. It was blue and white. Police rushed to speak with the victim, who told them the full story. She was on vacation in Tampa with a friend, when a friendly stranger approached them. After talking for a bit, he offered them a ride on his boat to watch the sun setting over Tampa Bay. Judy, the victim, accepted the ride, but her friend refused, so she ended up going on the boat on her own. While they were on the boat, the stranger made advances on Judy, but the 24-year-old told him to back off. The stranger, however, didn't comply, and forced himself upon her. After assaulting her, he'd thrown the camera she'd been taking pictures of the evening on overboard, and made her swim back to shore. Once on dry land, she reported it to the police, but the name the stranger had given her was fake, and after having to swim back to shore, any evidence left on her body had been washed away. A sketch of the suspect had been made with Judy's original description, and after speaking to her again, investigators produced a second one. They were convinced the man who attacked Judy was the same man who killed Joan, Michelle, and Christe, so police began pushing the sketch in the media, in hopes that someone could identify the man and provide new leads. However, none of the tips that came in were helpful, and the suspect remained anonymous. Nearly 3 years went by with no new developments, and investigators were getting anxious. This was turning into a cold case by the minute. Desperate to keep the case alive, they went over the evidence one more time, and while they analyzed the mysterious note for the 100th time, they had an idea. Several details in the stranger's handwriting were very particular. The way they wrote their Y's and their T's was very unique, and investigators thought it was worth a shot and decided to share the handwriting on the media, as well as billboards. For days, massive billboards containing evidence were seen by thousands of people driving on the highway around Tampa, asking the public to take a good look and keep an eye out for anyone with similar handwriting. The billboards were very interesting for drivers. This wasn't something that was usually done in investigations, but despite it being a long shot, it worked. After seeing one of the billboards, a woman called the Tampa police with information about the mysterious note. She had an old contract for an aluminium enclosure she had done at her home. When cross-examined by a professional, it was determined the 2 documents had been written by the same person. They now had a real name to chase down: Oba Chandler. Born in 1946, Oba Chandler worked as a contractor and lived only a mile away from where the Rogers parked their car the day they met him for a boat ride. Police paid him a visit straight away, but he stated he knew nothing about the murders. However, police had traced calls made from boats in the water to shore, and on the day of Judy's attack, as well as the day the Rogers were murdered, he called his wife in the evening to tell her he was having trouble with his boat engine and wouldn't be home until late. The time of the calls matched the time the women were meant to be on the boat with him. On September 24th of 1992, over 3 years after the Rogers family murders and Judy's attack, Oba Chandler was arrested. Judy was flown into Florida to identify Oba from a lineup of 6 men. She immediately recognized him as the man who attacked her in May of 1989. A palm print was also found on the brochure he'd written directions on, and it was a perfect match to his own print. When questioned about the boat, he told police he sold it, coincidentally, just days after the Rogers were murdered. Oba Chandler had a record since he was a teenager. He'd been charged for possession of counterfeit money, kidnapping, and armed robbery, among several sexual crimes. During his trial, he maintained his innocence, and even testified in his own defense. He admitted to meeting Joan and the girls and giving them directions, but he denied ever taking them on his boat. He said that night he was alone on the boat, and after having some engine trouble, he called the Coast Guard, justifying the calls he made from his boat. However, records showed he called his wife, not the Coast Guard. Judy testified against him, detailing how Oba had approached her with a friendly offer to see the sunset from his boat, and then assaulted her while they were out in the water. The details of the story were almost identical to what had been discovered of the Rogers' last moments alive. One of Oba Chandler's daughters also testified against him. In 1989, her father had paid her a visit unannounced, and admitted to her and her husband that he'd killed 3 women in Tampa. He told her he was scared to go back in case they arrested him. However, it's not clear why his daughter never reported this incident earlier. Oba Chandler was found guilty and sentenced to death in November of 1994. For years, he defended his innocence, but all of his appeals were denied, and in 2011, he was executed by lethal injection. In his 17 years in prison, he never had a single visitor. Before he was executed, he left a note with one final statement that read, "You are killing an innocent man today." If you look closely, in the note you can still see the particular Y's and T's that led investigators to discovering he was the one who committed the Rogers family murders.